A long time ago, at an agency far, far away, an officer devoted his entire life to law enforcement, to being a cop. This is who he heavily identified with in his profession, who he thought he was. He devoted himself so intensely that when he died, still active and sworn, he had his bones ground up and mixed in with the mortar of the building. So, keep that in mind as we discuss ego and identity. Two other comparisons I'm going to bring up is the story of Tyler Durden and the story of Job from the Bible. In Tyler Durden's story, Fight Club, they say, "You're not your job, you're not your fucking khakis." And Job from the Bible, for those that don't know, was this man in the Old Testament who was a farmer or a shepherd. He owned land and cattle and sheep, and he lost it all, including most of his family. At the end, he was left with himself and his faith. So, keep that in the back of your mind as we discuss ego and identity. So, the ego is who we think we are, and this is contrasted with the self of who we really are. The ego is more at the conscious level, at the surface, and the self is more at the unconscious level, deep within. The ego is a very yang energy. The self is a very yin energy, which is why men struggle, or masculine men struggle, to realize their own self at some points, because masculine men identify more with the yang energy, the intense, and less with the yielding energy. It's more feminine. So the ego is developed through societal interaction. It's an ideaplex that we develop of who we think we are as we interact with society. The ego is a separator, a divider, so that we can understand ourselves. And like I said, it's in contrast to the self, two halves of a whole. So when I'm going to reference Carl Jung before I move on to the next point. Carl Jung, in his book The Undiscovered Self, speaks about the ego and self-knowledge. Most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities. Anyone who has any ego consciousness at all takes it for granted that he knows himself, but the ego knows only its own contents, not the unconscious and its contents. So when we overinflate our ego for so long, you'll often see people experience what we call a midlife crisis. That doesn't necessarily mean it happens midlife, it's just the term we use because it generally comes about at a certain age. And so we call it the midlife crisis. And this guy, Paul Chek, defines a midlife crisis as occurring when your ego no longer has the energy to reinflate the persona it has manifested. So you keep putting these lies, these stories you tell yourself into your consciousness that I am this, I identify as this, etc. for so long, and it works for a while until you just no longer have the energy to keep that up. And so you experience this midlife crisis, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just pointing out something to you in your life, that you are not this who you think you are. So you just have to realize that. So to understand the ego a little bit better, if you would, take your hand and hold it out in front of you and tell yourself what it is. Most people will respond with, "my hand." This is the ego speaking, right? It is separating and dividing you, because really this is me, but the ego says this is my hand. It's possessive. So Just as if I were to hold a drop of water here in front of you and ask you what it is, most people would say it's a drop of water. They wouldn't call it the ocean, even though if it were in the ocean, that's what you would refer to it as. And that drop of water will eventually make its way back to the ocean, or it was removed from the ocean. It's a part of that. But again, the ego separates, and we call it a drop of water, not the ocean. If you're sitting in traffic, you say, I'm stuck in traffic, or most people will say that. But really, you are traffic. Again, the ego separates and says, I'm stuck in traffic, not I'm a part of traffic. The raindrop never feels responsible for the flood, just as the snowflake doesn't feel responsible for the avalanche. Which is a term I would use given this political climate with all the snowflakes causing this avalanche. But they don't feel responsible at the individual level for it. So, again, the ego is a separator, and hopefully those little things will point that out a little bit better to you to understand it. And the ego isn't a bad thing. Often it's used in a negative context, but really it's not a bad thing. It's just understanding it and not overinflating it. But you do have to appreciate that it drives you. It's what makes you stronger. So just understanding it. And without it, we wouldn't be able to interact with ourselves. We wouldn't be able to exchange thoughts with ourselves and decide things. So back to Tyler Durden. He points out that you're not your job, you're not your fucking khakis, right? Saying don't over-identify with your material possessions, with the uniform you wear, with the profession that you chose. Don't over-identify with these things, and ultimately it will make you more resilient. Just as Job in the Bible essentially lost his identity because he lost all his cattle and his family. That's what made him who he was in the physical manifested world. However, he didn't lose his real self. He didn't lose his faith in God, which made him resilient and able to carry on. So just some things to consider. It's not necessarily a bad thing to want to identify as one thing or another. Just understand what you're putting your life into. Henry David Thoreau told this parable of an Irishman who was working on the railway out west way back when, and the problem in this story that Henry David Thoreau was trying to point out was this guy was working, devoting his life towards somebody else's goal. He said that eventually the Irishman, as he's working on the railroad ties and laying them out, exhausted himself and just laid down and became the next railroad tie on the track. So again, that's not a bad thing if it's your goal, but if it's not your goal, you're just working towards somebody else's. Alright, so until next time, be dangerous.